The night was thick with mist as Ethan Calloway walked the narrow streets of Edinburgh, his footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. The rain had been relentless, drenching his threadbare coat, but his mind was too clouded to care. At 24, Ethan was drowning, buried under student loans, medical bills for his bedridden mother, and the lingering debts left behind by his late father. No matter how many shifts he picked up at the law library or how many corners he cut, the numbers never added up. That was when his phone rang. Ethan Calloway speaking. A voice, rich and composed, slipped through the receiver like silk. Mr. Calloway, my name is Vivian Lancaster. I have a proposal that may solve your financial burdens. Ethan frowned. I'm sorry, who? How do you know? I know enough, she interrupted smoothly. Meet me at Lancaster House. 8 p.m. Don't be late. And with that, the line went dead. An hour later, Ethan stood outside the massive Lancaster House, its stone facade rising against the stormy sky like an ancient monument. The estate was old, centuries old, but pristine, untouched by time. A butler led him inside, where a crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows along the oak-paneled walls. At the center of the room sat Vivian Lancaster, an imposing woman draped in midnight blue silk. Her silver hair was swept back, her features sharp with an elegance that only came with wealth and power. Mr. Calloway, she greeted, gesturing for him to sit. He hesitated but obeyed. You're probably wondering why you're here, she continued, pouring herself a glass of deep red wine. That would be an understatement. Her lips curved slightly. I won't waste your time. I need a husband. And you, Ethan, will be that husband. The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her expression remained eerily calm. Excuse me, he managed. It's a business arrangement, she explained, swirling her wine. You will marry me. In return, I will clear your debts, ensure your mother receives the best medical care, and provide you with financial stability beyond your imagination. Ethan scoffed. You expect me to believe this? You don't even know me. Vivian leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Exactly. That's why it will work. I require no love, no romance, just your name beside mine. I need a companion, and you, Mr. Calloway, need salvation. His jaw clenched. What's in it for you? For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, something colder than her words. Control. Over my legacy. Over my estate. And over the people who think they can take it from me. Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair, his mind racing. And if I refuse? Vivian smiled. Then you walk away. And when your creditors come knocking, your mother is forced out of her care facility, and your education is lost, you'll remember this moment and wish you had taken my hand. A sharp silence stretched between them. You have 24 hours to decide, she said, rising gracefully. But don't take too long. My generosity has limits. Ethan stumbled out of Lancaster House, his head spinning. Rain poured down, soaking him once more. What the hell had he just walked into? That night, he sat at his mother's bedside in the care facility, watching her frail form stir beneath the covers. She was getting worse. Ethan, she murmured, her voice weak. He took her hand. I'm here, Mum. Her tired eyes searched his. You look worried. He hesitated before telling her about Vivian's proposal. It's madness, he admitted. But it could save us. His mother was silent for a long time before squeezing his hand. Sometimes, we must make impossible choices to survive. The next morning, Ethan stood at the gates of Lancaster House once more. Vivian was waiting. I'll do it. Her lips curled into a knowing smile. Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. A week later, Ethan found himself in a grand cathedral, dressed in a suit that wasn't his, reciting vows that felt like shackles. The ceremony was quiet, attended only by Vivian's lawyer and a small handful of onlookers. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Vivian turned to him, her gloved hand slipping into his. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Calloway. There was no warmth in her voice. Only certainty. Ethan glanced at the towering stained glass windows, feeling an invisible weight settle over him. Had he just saved his family? Or had he sold his soul? As the newlyweds arrived at Lancaster House, a fleet of servants awaited them in the grand foyer. The house, once imposing from the outside, now seemed even more suffocating from within. Vivian swept ahead of him, issuing orders. Dinner at 7. Be punctual. Ethan followed a housekeeper up a marble staircase, led to his own separate bedroom. It was lavish, far more than he had ever known, but it felt cold. Unlived in. That evening, the dining table stretched endlessly between them, candlelight flickering off polished silverware. "How was your first day as a Lancaster?" Vivian asked, sipping from a crystal glass. Ethan forced a smirk. "Feels like I joined a secret society." Vivian chuckled. "You wouldn't be entirely wrong." Something in her tone sent a chill through him. As the days passed, Ethan noticed the locked doors scattered throughout the estate. No one spoke of them. The staff avoided his gaze. And whispers trailed behind him. "Why him? She never does anything without a reason. He'll find out soon enough." One evening, Ethan found himself in Vivian's study. A single golden key lay atop her desk. It glimmered under the light. His fingers hovered over it. And then, ever so slowly, he picked it up. The golden key was heavier than Ethan expected, its surface cool against his palm. He glanced toward the study doors, half expecting a servant to appear, but the house was eerily silent. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he turned the key over, studying its intricate design. What did it open? The whispers among the staff, the locked doors scattered across the estate, this key was a clue. Ethan took a slow breath, slid the key into his pocket, and slipped out of the study. That night, he lay in his massive, unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. Everything about Lancaster House felt off. Vivian barely spoke to him outside of public appearances. Their marriage was nothing more than a signature on a contract, a well-crafted illusion. And yet, something deeper lurked beneath it. He knew better than to ignore the feeling. Sometime after midnight, when the house was dark and silent, Ethan crept out of his room, the key burning against his palm. The hallway stretched endlessly, dimly lit by antique sconces. He passed doors he had never seen unlocked, each one untouched by time. And then, he found it. A black oak door, its brass handle engraved with the same design as the key in his hand. Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. Glancing over his shoulder, he turned the key. A soft click echoed in the silence. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was nothing like the rest of the house. Unlike the pristine, polished grandeur of Lancaster House, this space was old and untouched, a relic of the past. Dust covered every surface. A single oil painting hung on the far wall, its edges worn, its colors faded. And at the center of the room stood a large wooden desk, covered in letters, documents, and photographs. Ethan's breath hitched as he stepped closer. The first thing he saw was a marriage certificate. His name. Vivian's name. Dated 3 months before he had ever met her. His stomach lurched. She had planned this long before she approached him. Next, his gaze landed on an old newspaper clipping. The headline sent a chill through his bones. Wealthy businessman Archibald Lancaster found dead in his estate. No suspects named. Ethan's blood ran cold. Vivian's late husband. Beneath the article was a letter, written in Vivian's hand. It was addressed to Ethan's father. "You ruined everything. My husband, my fortune, my life. I will take from you what you took from me. The sins of the father must be paid by the son." The paper trembled in Ethan's grasp. This wasn't a marriage. It was retribution. Vivian had orchestrated this long before Ethan ever set foot in Lancaster House. He wasn't just a husband on paper. He was a pawn in her revenge. "Are you enjoying yourself?" The voice sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He spun around. Vivian stood in the doorway, clad in an elegant silk robe, her expression unreadable. Ethan's pulse pounded. "You married me to punish my father." Vivian stepped forward, her eyes dark and unreadable. "And what will you do now, husband?" His fists clenched. "I want the truth." Vivian sighed, walking toward the desk. She ran a hand along its surface, as if touching old wounds. Your father destroyed my family, Ethan. He and my husband were business partners once, until your father betrayed him. My husband died trying to fix the disaster your father left behind. Ethan shook his head. That wasn't my fault. Vivian's lips curled slightly. And yet, here you are. The weight of it all pressed down on him. Was this always the plan? He asked. To trap me in this? Vivian met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something else in her expression. Something almost tired. I thought revenge would feel more satisfying than this, she murmured. Ethan inhaled sharply. She wasn't denying it. The days that followed were suffocating. Ethan and Vivian continued their public charade, attending high society events and entertaining guests at Lancaster House. To outsiders, they were a wealthy, well-matched couple. Behind closed doors, they barely spoke. Ethan knew he needed to get out. But he had signed legally binding contracts. Vivian owned everything. He needed a plan. He turned to Daniel, an old friend from law school, under the guise of catching up. Hypothetically, Ethan asked, stirring his coffee, if someone was coerced into signing a marriage contract under false pretenses, could they get out of it? Daniel narrowed his eyes. That depends on the proof. Are you in trouble? Ethan forced a grin. Just a thought experiment. But he knew he needed more than legal loopholes. He needed leverage. Late one night, Ethan searched Vivian's study again. He rifled through locked drawers and hidden compartments, looking for anything that could help him. And then, he found it. A hidden ledger, filled with transactions, accounts, and names. It wasn't just revenge she had orchestrated. It was fraud. Money laundering. Bribery. Vivian Lancaster was far more dangerous than he had realized. She had built her empire on secrets. And now, Ethan had them. He took photos, copied pages, and stored them in a safe place. The next morning, he confronted her. Vivian sat in the parlor, sipping her tea, as if nothing had changed. Ethan dropped the documents onto the table. It's over. Vivian raised a brow, unfazed. What exactly is over, Ethan? He leaned closer. You orchestrated everything. You manipulated me. You lied to me. And now I have enough to bury you in legal trouble for the rest of your life. Vivian exhaled slowly, setting her cup down. For the first time, her expression wasn't smug. It was calculating. What do you want? Ethan clenched his jaw. Freedom. An annulment. And I walk away. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Vivian nodded. Vivian leaned back in her chair, studying Ethan with quiet amusement. You think you've won, she mused. That all of this will end with a signature on a piece of paper. Ethan's grip tightened around the documents in front of him. You don't have a choice. Vivian tilted her head. Don't I? A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, and Ethan suddenly felt the weight of what he was up against. He had evidence. He had leverage. But she had power. And people like Vivian Lancaster didn't simply lose. That evening, Ethan locked himself in his room, going over every detail of his plan. He had secured copies of the financial documents, but it wasn't enough. Vivian had connections, judges, politicians, people who could make this disappear if he wasn't careful. He needed to move fast. His escape had to be airtight. But as he scrolled through the files on his laptop, an email popped up. No subject. No sender. Ethan hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single message. You're not the first. His pulse pounded. Attached was a photograph. A wedding portrait. Not of him. But of another man, standing beside Vivian, dressed in an almost identical suit, smiling that same uncertain, uneasy smile. Beneath the image, a date, 12 years ago. And then, another message. Look deeper. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about him. Vivian had done this before. The next day, Ethan began digging. If there had been another husband, there had to be a record. Vivian had erased nearly every trace of her past marriages, but not completely. At the city archives, he found his name. James Sinclair. Married to Vivian Lancaster. Declared missing. Never found. Ethan's fingers curled around the paper. Missing? His stomach twisted. Had Vivian killed him? He had to find out before he became the next James Sinclair. That night, Ethan confronted her. Vivian was waiting for him in the parlor, as if she had expected it. A glass of deep red wine rested between her fingers. "You've been busy," she said lightly. Ethan tossed the documents onto the table. "What happened to James?" For a moment, Vivian simply looked at him, then let out a soft laugh. "Ah. So you finally found him." Ethan's stomach twisted. "He disappeared." "Yes. And you had nothing to do with that?" Vivian set down her glass, studying him with that same unreadable gaze. "Would it matter if I did?" A chill ran down his spine. "What did you do to him?" She sighed, standing slowly. "Ethan, you really need to understand something." She stepped closer. "Men like you think you control the world. But in the end? You are replaceable." Ethan's fists clenched. "I'm not afraid of you." Vivian smirked. "No? Then why are your hands shaking?" Ethan refused to give her the satisfaction of backing down. "This ends now." Vivian exhaled through her nose, as if slightly disappointed. "I suppose it does." She lifted her hand, and before Ethan could react, the door swung open. Two guards stepped inside, their expressions blank but their presence unmistakable. "Take him to the estate basement," Vivian said simply. Ethan barely had time to move before strong hands grabbed him. "Vivian," he shouted, struggling against them. "You can't just." She tilted her head. "Oh, Ethan. I can do whatever I want." And then the door slammed shut. The basement. The air was damp and cold. Ethan's wrists ached from the zip ties, his head throbbing from where one of the guards had shoved him against the stone wall. There was no light, only the faintest sliver of moonlight seeping in through a tiny, barred window near the ceiling. For hours, he sat in the silence, his mind racing. Vivian wasn't just trying to keep him quiet. She was going to make him disappear, just like James. Panic rose in his throat. He had to get out. Now. His hands worked furiously at the restraints, twisting, pulling, until the plastic finally snapped. His heart pounded as he stood, testing his balance. The door was locked. But the window. It was small, but not impossible. Ethan stacked an old crate beneath it and climbed. He could barely squeeze through, his ribs scraping against the metal bars, but he forced himself forward. And then, he fell. Landing hard in the grass outside, his lungs burned as he gasped for air. He was free. But Vivian wouldn't let him stay that way for long. He had to run. The final move. Ethan made his way into the city, his mind locked on a single goal, exposing Vivian before she could silence him permanently. He met Daniel in a dimly lit cafe, his clothes still damp with sweat. "Jesus, Ethan, what the hell happened to you?" Ethan slid his phone across the table. "Vivian Lancaster tried to kill me." Daniel paled as he flipped through the documents, the photos Ethan had taken, the missing person reports. "This is enough to take her down." Ethan nodded. "Then let's do it." Together, they compiled everything, evidence of fraud, forged marriages, missing husbands. By the time the police arrived at Lancaster House, Vivian was waiting. Calm. Dignified. But there was something else in her eyes. Resignation. As the officers handcuffed her, she turned to Ethan one last time. "You should have just taken the money." Ethan exhaled. "You should have just let me go." She smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" And with that, she was led away. Aftermath. Days later, Ethan sat in his small apartment, reading the headlines. Vivian Lancaster arrested. Connections to multiple disappearances under investigation. He had done it. He was free. But as he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against something cold. A single, golden key. Vivian's last gift. A reminder. That for all her power, she had lost. And so, with a slow breath, Ethan dropped the key into the fire, watching the flames consume it. It was over. For good. The end.